Ladies, gentlemen, and exiles of all ages, it's been around 2.5 weeks since the release of Early Access for Path of Exile 2, and with the amount of time that has passed, more and more players are hitting deeper endgame points. The people with strong builds are getting even better gear to improve their builds, and there are a few more interesting concepts of builds that have popped up in power as the players who came up with them have been able to get in and show proper proof of concept with better gear. So today, once more, we are going to stop and I'm going to share with you all the most interesting and intriguing super high power level builds that I have seen for each ascendancy. We've reached a point where some of these will be the same as last time, but with various improvements or adjustments by the creator, though a number of them are radically different from the last time we spoke about it too. As well, every one of these builds has had a ton of time and effort put into it by its original creator, and they will have their channel on the screen when I'm talking about their build, so if you find yourself interested in what you're seeing on screen and the way I'm describing it and want to know in more detail how to do it for yourself, feel free to go ahead, check them out too, and ask. First up then, we'll start with the Warrior and the Titan Ascendancy, and this is a build that I've had my eye on since the very release of Early Access because I just find it to be a really fun concept. The main core of it all is taking Hammer of the Gods, which is just this big fuck-off damage ability that does a ton of damage but has a stupidly long cooldown. How do you take advantage of that best? Well, make it do even more damage without lowering the cooldown, turn it into fire damage to make it ignite enemies, and because ignite magnitude scales off of the damage of the hit that applies it, when applied with a juiced up Hammer of the Gods, it just does millions of damage in a single button press, which is absolutely silly. This build also has the ability to hit ridiculous points of tankiness, and past that outside of Hammer of the Gods for bosses or particularly large rare enemies, most of the actual map clearing was done using Stampede with the Devastate support gem, which completely breaks enemy armor on heavy stunning them, with the Armor Explosion support gem as well, which causes explosions from enemies when their armor gets fully broken. This was clearing screens all by itself by funneling into itself, as the explosions from the support gem could trigger armor break on new enemies and then make them also explode as a result, and this would just chain and chain and chain until a pack was dead. They made it in the recent patch so that armor explosion cannot break armor itself anymore, however, and so now the solution has been to rearrange some passives and some support gems so you break armor on heavy stun from your passive tree and then work in more damage into Stampede itself. It doesn't quite clear whole screens the same way, but the damage is technically higher if anything, and Hammer of the Gods is still doing what it does, which is just some silly shenanigans. That said, moving on next, we have the Warbringer, and we're changing things up this time for Warbringer, as this time I want to stop and have a chat about pure Warcry Warbringer. This one is extremely unique looking, focused completely around Seismic Cry for its damage, in combination with the Warbringer Ascendancy nodes that make Warcries explode corpses nearby for 25% of their life as damage, and the node that makes you ignore Warcry cooldowns. You can then use Infernal Cry to build up your rage, you've got totems and Hammer of the Gods to maximize your damage against larger enemies or bosses as well, but for general mapping and mob clearing purposes, you literally just walk around screaming and screaming and screaming and you just kill things. It then also gets massive tankiness through the Svalin unique shield, which gives you lucky block chance, which means that block rolls twice when an enemy tries to hit you, and while the shield normally has the downside of super low base block chance to make up for it, Warbringer has a specific ascendancy node that sets your base block chance to 40% regardless on any shield in the game. Then there's another node that lets you block damage from all hits even with your shield not raised, so this in combination with block chance increases as well can give you the equivalent of something like 2 60% rolls back to back on blocking any attack that tries to hit you even without raising your shield, which is pretty ridiculous survivability potential on top of all that too. Next up then we have the Sorceress, starting with the Stormweaver Ascendancy, and this thing has just been going nuts, with the strongest builds all being some variation of a high damage area of effect sprawling lightning skill like Spark or Arc combined with Archmage's persistent buff aura, which gives you multiplicative bonus lightning damage on spells per maximum mana that you have, at the cost of making your spells cost a lot more mana. You then also build through Mind Over Matter as a keystone, which is in the passive tree and makes all damage come from your mana before your life pool. You can then make lightning damage scale ridiculously off of your intelligence stat, which also gives you maximum mana to have it, and so you can essentially just end up building totally around the concept of increasing your maximum mana through intelligence and other bonuses to create just a metric ton of lightning damage even with your more basic attacks, and then that leaves you just a bunch of space to work around it too, using things like Blink for movement, Enfeeble to reduce enemy damage for more threatening foes, Eye of Winter for bonus crit chance against bosses, but this is just a setup that is arguably the strongest conceptual one around for most players because the barrier to entry on an Archmage Stormweaver isn't actually that crazy expensive to start with, but of course the actual top-end scaling with near perfect gear just becomes absolute insanity if you do have the orbs to create it. Next up then we have Chronomancer, which has been a bit awkward on and off, but while it seemed to have tapered off early, we do actually have the return of Hammer of the Gods, Chronomancer. The general concept is actually extremely similar to how it's been working for Titan. Take a super high damage, high cooldown skill in Hammer of the Gods, build damage over time on top of it. In this case, the creator is still testing fire versions versus bleed versions, and the general consensus is that it sort of depends on the enemy, but overall leaning towards fire being better. However, the core of it is big high damage skill with long cooldown, but because you are a Chronomancer, you can build in the ascendancy nodes that give you a chance to not trigger cooldown when using an ability, and build the skill that resets cooldowns as a whole, Time Snap. And with that, you can just chain as many hammers, and RNG will actually allow you to, before you have to stop, which of course can get quite silly if you can use multiple Hammer of the Gods in a row. Then for your main clear, like Titan, it's mostly just Stampede, juiced up to overkill and spread damage all around the place. Moving on to the mercenary class, let's start with the Witchhunter. And well, since launch, the build everyone has been talking about has been Gas Grenade with auto ignites to trigger it, and while that still does extremely well for specifically mapping and mob clearing, where it starts to taper off a little bit is with bosses, and the further into endgame you get, the bigger the bosses get and the more the bosses start to matter, especially when you start like engaging with like pinnacle boss content. The solution? A build that is nearly as good as mapping, though with a bit more effort to get there, built heavily around galvanic shards, which is the shotgun shot for crossbows that then creates chain lightning off of any enemy that it hits, causing a lot of damage stacking against enemies that are stood on top of each other, but then a stacking of voltaic mark and plasma shot to just straight up one-shot map bosses too. And on pinnacle bosses, well, here's the tier 3 breach boss taking a quarter of its health on fight opening just from plasma burst, then voltaic mark and some burst lightning damage, and then just slowly taking down the rest of the health bar with shock burst rounds just for some solid consistent lightning damage against enemies that are affected by lightning based ailments, and then of course Stormcaller Arrow for if the ailment runs out before the fight ends, to reapply it easily by having a bow in your second weapon set, as well as adding lightning exposure into the mix with a support gem slotted in here too. After that we have the Gemling Legionnaire, and this one has just exploded recently, as some of the players that have buttloads of currency orbs have made the swap over to Gemling Legionnaire, as this ascendancy was sort of always expected to be the one with the most scaling potential in deep endgame due to its ability to have bonus skill gem slots, to use the same support gem multiple times, and to scale all attributes with ascendancy nodes as well. But this is the thing that has really caught my eye of late. It's essentially, for all intents and purposes, the Exodia build in Path of Exile 2. It requires a unique quarterstaff that gives you different boosts based on how much of each attribute you have, unique gloves that do similarly, and then just stacking a bunch of different uniques as well that give you just all 3 attributes in plentiful amounts, with a focus on intelligence for lightning damage and area of effect as well as dexterity for massive attack speed, and if you get the right gear built around it too, and focus on building up all attribute nodes within the passive tree, you can achieve something that screen clears with what is essentially an auto attack, and does it consistently in high tier maps. The creator says the only issue that it really has right now is mana sustain, but that is definitely something that is fixable if this is the base build underneath it, and it just looks absolutely busted to watch it walk through a map doing barely anything and still killing everything. Then after that we have the Ranger with the Deadeye ascendancy still blasting through packs like no tomorrow, with the lightning rod focused build. For those who haven't seen it before, it essentially works completely around the damage of lightning rod itself as a skill. This pulses damage out around it when it's hit by a chain lightning effect. For mobbing, you can mostly get away with just firing lightning arrow because it's strong enough on its own with good gear. For anything slightly larger, you do throw out a lightning rod before your lightning arrows, and it just disintegrates them. Then for bosses, you throw down an orb of storms, which chains lightning whenever you cast a lightning skill standing nearby it, and then just spam down lightning rods, forcing the orb of storms to proc into all of them with chain lightning in a small radius, which will obliterate any boss that's standing inside of it. Though it does have very high mana cost that you do have to solve through your gear, with the best way being the unique ring that is the only source of mana gain on hit from gear in the game. Then for the other ascendancy for this base class, the Pathfinder, we have a newcomer build I'd like to really highlight, which is Poison Concoction Pathfinder. Pathfinder is always going to be at its best when focusing around poison damage, as that's a really big part of its class identity. However, the other main part of its class identity potential is concoctions, the ability to turn flasks into damage abilities. This is Poisonous Concoction, which turns your flash charges into a poison bomb. It can get through mapping, no problem, but where I find it really impressive is when it comes to its boss damage, where the burst of a poison concoction when built up and built around becomes just sort of absolutely nutty. Though the creator says it does have the obvious issue of running out of flash charges before you can get through like a full tier 4 pinnacle boss health bar, but pretty much everything below that amount of health isn't really a problem. Of course, the main way to solve this in the future is just by building more sources of flash charge generation and flash charges gained per second, as that is the way, as long as you can survive, that you will never fully technically run out of flasks, but the build's creator is still looking for an even better way of doing things with this. However, I thought that this was just absolutely worth sharing with you all after I saw it doing its thing. After that, we have the monk with the Invoker ascendancy, which as of this moment has actually overtaken the #1 spot on the ladder race to 100. The player doing this is in an absolutely insane setup that mostly focuses around Stormwave and shattering with Herald of Ice to deal with mobbing as a whole, including the unique ring that lets you shatter chilled enemies as if they were frozen to make it even easier, and then for bossing, the combination of Tempest Flurry with Tempest Bell, using Sniper's Mark to generate frenzy charges, the Resonance Keystone passive that changes frenzy charges into power charges, and then using those power charges to fuel Charged Staff for loads of bonus lightning damage on top of it all as well. This build also uses Blink as a persistent buff aura with the Temporalis unique body armor, which is one of the most expensive items in the game, but what it does is reduce all of your cooldowns by up to 4 seconds, and this makes the cooldown of Blink essentially be 0, which lets you blink every time that you hit the dodge button. This doesn't necessarily add offensive power, but it does help show why this player has overtaken the #1 spot on the ladder, and it's why their gameplay just looks so absolutely bonkers. Their pure speed moving around maps is insane, on top of just one-shotting every mob that isn't a boss as well. Then after that, we have the Acolyte of Chayula, and this ascendancy is still doing fine. Honestly, it's trucking along, with the best build that I've seen for it still to this point being just pure poison stacking through Gas Arrow, Toxic Growths, and Vine Arrow as well, still functioning fine even after the nerf to Vine Arrow's poison damage, but for the most part, the way that this ascendancy works is boosting things that are very generic. So you could technically use any build really that doesn't full-on require a different ascendancy to function, and if you use it on Acolyte of Chayula, it would work fine, with some bonuses from the Flames of Chayula 2 added on top, as well as due to the ascendancy itself. Moving on, we have the Witch-based class with the Infernalist ascendancy as the strongest setup that I'm seeing for this right now, is a return of Summon Raging Spirits, or SRS as a lot of people call it. This is triggered through Flame Wall, as often it is, and then adding on Skeletal Snipers on top of that to boost their own damage with projectiles going through the Flame Wall to gain fire damage in the first place. Aside of this, you just stack a ton of maximum life to let you go up to over 300 maximum spirit through the Infernalist ascendancy node that gives you bonus spirit scaling off of your maximum life, and then using the mana conversion into Infernal Flame nodes as well. They are also using the Chaos Inoculation passive to set their life to 1, but makes themselves immune to chaos damage, and then just going full on into Energy Shield scaling for absolute ridiculous survivability potential while letting all of the minions go to work, with Pain Offering to give them their burst windows on top of it all too. Then finally, we have the Blood Mage ascendancy, which is going through its paces of finding strong things. It was sort of struggling to come into its own until recently, where I started to see Detonate Dead builds starting to pop off, especially for them. There are Detonate Dead builds for Infernalist 2, of course, but for Blood Mage, they take advantage of their specific place of being able to build up a bit into minions without diving fully into minions, because that's something that Infernalist is just way better at. Instead, you have Detonate Dead as a perfect sort of middle ground where you have minions involved and they are part of the build, but you use them as a resource for your damage rather than as the damage themselves. This is capable of just full-on popping and basically one-shotting a lot of map bosses, as well as just being strong for mapping in general in its own right too. That pretty much does it for today then, everyone. A discussion breaking down some of the best builds in the game, the coolest things that I have seen going on for each and every ascendancy as of this moment. Some old, a lot new, and all of them extremely, extremely powerful. Maybe you just tuned in to see what the sort of peak of your ascendancy is achieving at the moment. Maybe you just wanted some ideas for how to maybe adjust your build as you get further into the game too. Either way, I hope you enjoyed your time here today. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.